Welcome everybody to Constellations Conversations with me, Robert Rowland Smith, and Nicola Dunn. Hello, Nicola.
Hi, Robert.
Um, we thought we'd try and tackle the subject of vulnerability today. So I'm going to say a few things to get us going. Not particularly well thought through, I have to say, but something to kick us off. And I suppose the first thing to say is that when we run a constellation, it's almost by definition, a kind of a space of vulnerability in some way for almost everybody in the room. So let me just break that down. Typically in a constellation, we have somebody bringing an issue, in other words, a problem or a question that hasn't been resolved yet, and they want to get some clarity on or some resolution on. And almost by definition there, I think they're arriving with some vulnerability, partly because they're sitting in a group watched by people they don't necessarily know, and revealing often very personal, even intimate things about their own lives. So there's a vulnerability that goes just with the physical setup, I suppose. And then for the issue holder, there's also the vulnerability to the constellation, because although they might arrive with a certain problem and a narrative that surrounds it, they might find that the constellation disabuses them of that narrative and gives them a very different account of what's going on. So they're vulnerable in the sense of having their inner reality or inner narrative or story about themselves retold or reframed in some way. So there's the vulnerability, and maybe one definition of vulnerability is the readiness to accept potential loss or something like that. That I'm vulnerable insofar as I'm recognizing that I might lose something, or I might be wounded in some way. In fact, the word vulnerability comes from the Latin word for wound. So it's probably worth remembering that, related a bit to trauma, though trauma is a Greek word. So there's the issue holder's vulnerability. There's probably even in the circle, there's some vulnerability there, partly because people are sitting in a circle, so they are seen in a way that they wouldn't necessarily be if they were behind a board table, for example, or even online. And there's often an opening round where people, even if they're asked simply to say their name and something about themselves, there's a kind of vulnerability there because they're not in control necessarily of the situation. There's a process which is to be adhered to, and there's a little moment of exposure when we introduce ourselves. And I think there will be degrees of self-consciousness among people when they do introduce themselves, but I'd be surprised if for anybody, even an opening round doesn't bring with it a modicum of vulnerability. Oh, it's my turn. I'm coming next. I've got to say my name and say something about myself. There's the vulnerability of the constellator, and almost again by definition, because as constellators, we rarely know what's coming at us in advance. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we'll have a chat beforehand with the issue holder, but even then, there may be new and surprising elements that kind of come at us from the issue holder's account. So we are almost necessarily vulnerable in the sense of being open, open to surprise. And then that persists, I think, during the constellation for the constellator, who, again, because although the constellator can control many elements in a constellation, who comes in, who goes out, and so on, can't really control the data that the representatives report. And in that sense, the constellator needs necessarily to be vulnerable to what comes out. And I'll just make the point again that vulnerability isn't just about being open. If we remember the etymology, it's being open to a potential wound. Not that the wound will definitely come, but there's a risk that it might. So being vulnerable is saying, look, I'm going to be open here, even though there's a potential for me being hurt in this process. So just being open when we know we feel completely safe is not the same as vulnerability. I think vulnerability contains the possibility of being hurt in some way. So there's a bravery that goes with vulnerability. And I think it's worth connecting. bravery or courage and vulnerability in some way. So there's a starter for 10. I don't know if you'd want to react to any of those things.
I will react. That's wonderful. Thank you, Robert. So I was thinking about this wonderful illumination that vulnerability has a connection to wounds, wounding, and I had this idea that, you know, what is a wound? A wound is a break in the defense. It is, you know, if we think of a physical wound, you get to see the inside on the outside. And if you think of a physical wound in the skin, you see the kind of layers of tissue. You see something, which is often why we recoil. We see something which we know we almost shouldn't see on the outside.
Mm.
And so I think there is, you know, we all have wounds. So, if we think about vulnerability, we also need to think about defendedness. And there is an openness, but as you say, it's an openness sharing that which has been painful or hurt or somehow enduring within our own family systems. And I would say the constellator has a role in that, in the sense that in this openness, this vulnerability that a client or issue holder seeker is offering to the group, the constellator has a role to ensure that any sort of material coming the client's way is therapeutic rather than projection by the people in the room or somehow unrelated to the client's own issue or their system's issue. So vulnerability in an open, marauding crowd, it's vulnerability within a therapeutic context of a system, and systems, I'm not going to say colliding systems, but we're all sitting there with the resources and wounding of our own systems. And somehow the constellator navigates that.
Mm. We have decided previously not necessarily to talk about trauma, because trauma is slightly overdone these days as a word. But I will just make the link, because I think there is a link between vulnerability and trauma, but also a difference between them. Again, I'm thinking of the etymology here. So in Greek, the word trauma also means a wound, but the root of the word is in the verb behind the noun, which is actually to pierce, as in to pierce the skin. So you talked about a kind of breach in the outside, showing the inside. So there's a strong connection between the vulnerability and the wound there. Nevertheless, I think I would make a distinction between vulnerability and trauma, perhaps, because vulnerability doesn't necessarily mean there will be a wound or there has been a wound, but it means there might be a wound. Whereas trauma, I think, means there was a wound and we haven't recovered from it.
Most definitely. And there'll be, sort of 100 people listening to this who could all comment on trauma.
Yeah.
But with vulnerability, it's something about the removal of defenses, of armor, the being humble in the face of that which is important to you.
Yes. And I like that, because that's almost an opposition, isn't it? I think, between being vulnerable and being defended.
Yes.
Now, there's good and bad defendedness in my view. There's defendedness as in defensiveness. I'm protecting myself or things about me a bit more than they need to be protected for, psychological reasons. But there's also a good defended. And I was thinking, I was lucky, on Friday, my daughter had her first child. And I was thinking about the state of being a child, which we will all have been. And one of the things that defines early childhood, apart from youth, is vulnerability, I think, or even helplessness, we could describe it as. And there's nothing more vulnerable than a newborn baby, I would imagine. But we learn over time during childhood to uh, balance or compensate for the vulnerability through layers of defense. We add in layers of defense, rightly so. We need them, often in the form of ego, which is that function. Well, often we often think of the ego as a very wholly bad thing, but there are ways in which it's a necessary thing, particularly in early life, because the ego is that thing, that agency which looks out for our best interests. So the ego is actually that thing which, as babies, makes us cry for food, for example. That's I want. In a Freudian definition, that's what the ego is, I want. And that's good that you're calling out for food, crying out for food, because you have to have it for survival. And in that sense, you're moving from vulnerability to something more assertive, and you're defending, you're preserving the integrity of the self or the ego in some way. So I think we are talking about, or maybe you're referring to, if I understand you rightly, vulnerability not as letting go of the ego in the good sense, because we need an ego in some ways to survive and to look out for our best interests and to watch for danger and so on. But the defendedness or defensiveness, which is a bit like a carapace that's grown upon that, it's a kind of something, I guess, kind of necrotic or sclerotic overlay, which we've habituated ourselves to and don't necessarily need anymore. And it's whether we can remove that extra layer of defensiveness in order to learn, because the defensiveness we see in people is often a resistance to learning or changing or accepting things which are perceived to be hurtful.
Well, and there's this interesting question, isn't there, about does healing ever occur or evolution if there isn't vulnerability?
Can you say more about that?
Well, I think in order to allow something else to come in,
Right.
or something new, something to evolve, there is a letting go, because otherwise you stay with the worldview you have. We've spoken before, we've given examples of, I think the mother who, when the let's imagine the adult child calls up for Mother's Day and says, Happy Mother's Day. And they go, well, this is a bit late, isn't it? So they're immediately sort of slapped down the first moment. But actually, so that you could stay with that dynamic of my mother's difficult, or there could be a wider expansion around what has made her believe that she is so unappealing that people won't want to be in contact with her. So there's a, it requires an openness, a letting go of something, and one is vulnerable in letting go of one's fixed versions of people, particularly important people in them.
Yeah, and that letting go, that's interesting. That's what allows us to be changed in some way.
Exactly. And whether you see that spiritually, whether you see that therapeutically, it doesn't really matter. But there is a potential, otherwise none of us would ever evolve. We would stay, as you said, as the child who says, I want, and just keep shouting that. And really, in that sense, doesn't move out of survival, and therefore is not very relational.
I love that. And in that sense, non-vulnerability is more of a regression than a progression. It's
about survival.
It's a survival instinct. Yes, that's right. And as survival, it's also resistance to change. It's survive rather than grow. It's
exactly. And survive is just to maintain what you have and stay where you are almost.
Yeah.
And so that growth and evolution requires a little bit of space just for things to have movement.
Yeah. A couple of things I want to bring in. One is about what we see in a constellation, particularly as an effect of some of the systemic sentences that can be used and the vulnerability that comes about when we use sentences. But first, I just wanted to register, I suppose, that as far as I can tell, vulnerability also has a gender dimension to it, particularly in relation to men who are often accused of not being vulnerable or praised for being vulnerable, because vulnerability is, rightly or wrongly, I might be wrong in saying this, but I think culturally, or at least in our culture, men are not supposed to be vulnerable. They're supposed to be strong, courageous, stoic, and vulnerability is perceived as a sign of weakness. Often, if you're vulnerable, then you're incapable of making it through the world without, being given breaks or being mollycoddled and so on. So it's the kind of antithesis of the masculine, possibly macho ideal. So I think it is worth checking that. I don't know if there is as much an equivalent on the other side that says women should be vulnerable. I don't think it's quite symmetrical like that, but there is certainly a discourse around, manly men shouldn't be vulnerable, and yet when they are, it's kind of incredibly appealing and winning in some ways.
Yes. So I would say, just if I occupy the female side for a moment, I think the maiden is allowed to be vulnerable.
Right.
And that's appealing.
Yeah.
Considered appealing. The mother is meant to be more stoic and capable and ready for self-sacrifice. And the grandmother is meant to be, wise and also a kind of stoicism, actually, and a more of a background figure, a resource for the younger members of the family. So I think the license for vulnerability and really remains more with the maiden than with the other stages of female experience.
Yeah. And just another thing that occurred to me on the male side of things and vulnerability. I mean, there's a lot, as a man, through the algorithms on social media or whatever, I'm conscious of seeing adverts directed at men, you must talk and not hide your feelings. It's good to share, do reach out, make sure that, if you're unwell, you go to the doctor. Men are terrible at going to the doctor, for example. I'm lumping those things together because there does seem to be these days in our culture a kind of counter movement that says to men, look, you've been too stoical for too long and only you have suffered from it, because you're containing all of these issues and anxieties and emotions because you're scared of seeming vulnerable, and it's not doing anybody any good. So there is a kind of quite a strong counter movement, I think, these days, that it's encouraging men to embrace vulnerability.
And of course, we're talking from a heterosexual point of view, and of course, within LGBT plus communities, those stereotypes are different,
Yeah.
But still prevalent about about who's allowed to be vulnerable and how much, and a generational divide.
Yeah.
There are things said about different generations about where vulnerability might be seen as a weakness and self-obsession. And so I think we can only, I suppose, speak to the culture that we know and live in, but that it's vulnerability is in these times seen as a positive thing, but just not too much of it.
Yeah. The generational point I find interesting. I was thinking of my parents' generation, which they were children during the Second World War. But I think nevertheless, they were in the slipstream of that almost military idea: stiff upper lip, keep calm and carry on. Don't be vulnerable, just be persistent, tenacious, buttoned down, a bit Victorian about things.
Yes.
Because actually, I mean, maybe to your survival point, that actually in times of crisis, survival is the best we can hope for, and survival and vulnerability don't really go together. So, and maybe it's even a sort of social thing. We're all in this together. There's a war. Don't you know there's a war on? We're all in this together. We've all got to put on a brave face here for the sake of each other.
And in constellations, we often see that when we represent the layers of different generations, don't we? With a grandparent or a great grandparent, And a sentence I sometimes use in those moments is for, let's say, maybe a great grandfather to say to a grandfather or whatever, I'm a man of my times.
Ah, that's brilliant. I love that. I had a great grandfather in the constellation I was doing last night, and that would have worked very well had I had you in my earpiece last night.
But it's just that acknowledgement that we are looking back through the eyes of our own generation with expectations about the capacity of our kind of ancestors to reveal themselves.
Which brings me back to this notion of sentences and vulnerability. So I'm a man of my time. What I like about that, I found it a beautiful sentence. And I think because it's a statement of strength insofar as it stands in a reality. I am a man of my, how can we deny that? It's empirically true. And with that come all sorts of prejudices, beliefs, values that may now be considered outdated, but were completely valid at the time. So it has a rootedness in its time. At the same time, it's sort of saying, I'm a man of my time, meaning I have some limits here. I'm a man of this time and not your time. I may be judged for it. This time isn't every time. This time came and went, and it had its deficiencies. And I, as a man of my time, inhabited those deficiencies myself, and I'm vulnerable in the sense that I wasn't perfect in that, and my time wasn't perfect in that. I like that a lot.
Yes, it has familial and social permissions.
Yeah.
Time, and those are different now.
Yeah.
And for just take an example, I know it's a sort of rather hackneyed, but this idea that fathers might show love to sons without quotes making them soft.
Yeah.
But actually, it might be a strengthening process.
It also suggests all of us, because this is a more philosophical point, because we live in time. You and I, Nicola, roughly the same age. There are generations beneath us and above us. In 100 years' time, inevitably, I suppose, values will have shifted. Our values today may seem very outdated, and so on. We may look very silly, in the future, through the eyes of a future generation. We are vulnerable, and almost existentially, to that change of values over time, to that change of circumstance and context over time. So we're vulnerable to the fact we can't anticipate what's going to come. We're vulnerable to being only in this time.
Yes. And that even now, as generations look up to us, generations that are younger, we would be seen as old school.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and we're vulnerable. We are literally vulnerable to the jibes, criticisms, sniggers of younger people.
Of course, and all we can do is just occupy the space we're in. And I suppose that comes into constellations, does it, as constellators?
Yeah.
On the one hand, we have experience with, we've been doing it for a while. And also we need to be open to different ways of living and being for our younger issue holders and seekers.
Yes.
That what might seem a good pathway for them is something we need to discover.
Yeah. And of course, that made me think of the vulnerability of representatives themselves. Last night in the constellation I was running, the very first constellation involved a representative who'd never done any constellations before. He was the first person to be chosen, bounced into the middle of this constellation, set him up just on his own. And of course, he was game, but nevertheless, you could immediately sense his vulnerability. Now, he was vulnerable because he was new to it and didn't know what to expect and so on. But I think that's only the vulnerability with which he arrived is in principle no different from the vulnerability with which every representative steps into a constellation. You and I don't represent as much as we constellate probably these days, which is probably a shame actually in some ways. But we know when we represent, we step into the circle, and our vulnerability is the resource that the constellation needs, because we're saying, you know, I'm Robert or I'm Nicola, and at the same time, I am vulnerable to the to receive things which I can't anticipate by representing somebody or something else. And it may feel bad, may feel awkward, may feel difficult. And in a certain, maybe I'm overstating this point, but in a way, constellations, because it depends on people representing people and things they don't know, relies on vulnerability. I mean, that is the central resource of all constellations. I mean, constellations couldn't happen without the vulnerability of representatives to what they're representing.
And that's the offering from the representatives. And of course, the issue holder who's having their issue constellated will then be a representative later on in someone else's constellation. But I think when you come to a constellation workshop, if you're open, and most people are to representing, that's what you give. And the likelihood is that you will receive something that is, I would say, evolutionary, something that will help you to evolve, provide growth, provide illumination, expand you in some kind of way. And that all people in the room, to a degree, are expanded. The constellator, the seeker, the issue holder, and the representatives.
I agree with that. And I'd say even where one represents a troubled individual, I mean, I can remember, well, one particular occasion where I represented somebody very troubled, you know, suffering from a psychosis. It was a disturbing experience, but as you say, it was a opening, learning experience for me too. And I don't like the word empathy too much, but it was an experience of deep empathy for me with what it's like to be in that kind of hellish mental environment that somebody with that kind of affliction is going through. But equally, you know, I'm thinking of another constellation in which a man had lost his wife, and to experience that deep sense of being bereft, you know, to which I was willingly vulnerable and felt deeply, if only briefly, of course, as a representative, did exactly what you're saying. It gave me a lesson in human emotion that I wouldn't necessarily have otherwise derived.
I mean, I have learned more through representing than I've probably learned through anything else.
Yeah.
And the more, complex the representation, the more I've learned. So I would say, if you're interested in things like and principles of diversity and inclusion, try representing, because the capacity to othering to other people is dissolved. Because you understand, you have a brief moment of standing in someone else's shoes, and whether it's disability, trauma, pain, grief, mental health issues, addiction, you realize that it's not so easy. It's not so easy in that moment. And the people that are vilified most are the ones that you will gain the most from representing.
Yeah. I mean, in that sense, Constellations is an exercise in overcoming otherness, not just othering, but otherness in general. It's not that we all sort of feel like we're the same as everybody else. It's not like that. But our tolerance for or acceptance of difference is hugely expanded, I think.
And understanding that someone else's pain is like our pain and yet different too. And so what you're learning about is the part of their pain that is different.
That's absolutely brilliant, Nicola. I love that. Yes, the pain is similar but different too. Yes, and we're learning about that bit, which is different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it expands us.
It expands us. And it expands us through the feeling of hurt that we feel, the wound.
Yes, the connection.
Yeah, the connection. Yeah. Now, I'm conscious of time, so we don't have a kind of whole lot time more to discuss today. But I just want to talk about Constellations as an event and vulnerability, mainly because, again, I'm thinking of this workshop last night. For everybody, I think, arriving at a workshop, there is a sense that this is a collective endeavor of vulnerability, and that in that sense, last night I often give a little spiel at the beginning of Constellations, depending on my current interests. And the spiel I gave yesterday was around the question of whether or not Constellations is a spiritual practice. Now, maybe that's something we'll come back to. And my broad answer is, certainly it's not a religious practice, but it has some things in common with spiritual practices. One of the things it has in common with spiritual practices is the idea of, number one, congregation. We're coming together here. And number two, ritual. We're coming together into a space in which we respect a process rather than try to override a process like with a ritual. So it's spiritual in that sense, I think, too. We are smaller than the process, the collective process. The individual is smaller than the collective process, I suppose. And thirdly, I think it's spiritual in the sense that we gather collectively with benign intent. We're coming here as a group to create something positive, as opposed to, for example, tonight I'm going to the football. I'm a big football fan, as you know. Most people in the stadium support the team that I support, and actually we're in opposition. There is opposition there. When we gather, it's not a spiritual event going to the Arsenal, but going to Constellations kind of is. There's no opposition there. We have a shared benign collective agenda, I think. So there are at least three ways in which I think it's a spiritual event, and all of those require a kind of vulnerability, saying we are risking something in coming here because we're not in control of the process completely.
And I would add, just to put a cherry on the marzipan, that I think we in a Constellation workshop, we open ourselves to a brief glimpse of transcendency.
Wonderful.
So thank you everyone for listening to us. If you are inclined, it would be wonderful if you could like, share and subscribe. That helps to keep us motivated. And if you'd like to contact Robert, you can find him via his website, robertrowlandsmith.com, or myself at nicoladanconstellations.com. And we both hope to see you again. Thank you.